Hello, SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. This will be part 7 in this series about the pentagram. Links to the previous episodes, I'll try to remember to put the playlist in previous description, but we're looking at the importance of a pentagram in different variations, so in the measure sense, but also in the traditions, religion, mystical, spiritual, but more on the weights and measures. And so previous ones, or when it's a dimensionality, so the degrees of the compass, which is a measure of direction, measures of length, also dimensions we went into, and measures of time was in the previous episode, but now we'll look at the thermometer and how weights and measures degrees of the thermometer, a measure of temperature. Now, what is heat and cold? Interesting. So for a long time they thought that cold was a force, but eventually it was discovered that cold is the absence of heat. So there's heat, and the lack of heat makes cold. Cold is not a force, but there's also a connection between pressure and temperature. And so, for instance, the barometer, because the measures of pressure also will come into this. Lovely system of how it joins up. So, but from the freezing cold to the average, living biological temperatures up to the boiling hot. Now, Australia is usually connected with heat, and it is, especially in the summer, it gets hot. But we also do have snow. So, in case you just think it's all hot here in Australia, well, we do have snow during the winter months on our alpine region. But now back to the pentagram and the numbers, and that's a upwards facing pentagram. If you do the inverted pentagram, more to come on that. But also how we got to this 33, 153, 273 through the clock, and this sacred geometry, the vesica, the seed of life, that goes back to the earlier episodes. But how do these connect? Through temperature, the thermometer. So to begin with, the average human temperature ranges from about 36, 36.1, 36.2, depending, up to about 37.2. I included that one. I was a little bit unsure, but anyway, because temperature ranges, but still it's in there. So if you're at exactly 36 degrees Celsius, you're not exactly unhealthy. It's just a fraction of a degree below what we call the average healthy human body temperature. But then we have average room temperature, the most comfortable room temperature to exist in, and that's 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Now that's also a bit subjective, but usually, if you do a search for it, you'll find that 72 degrees or 22.22 degrees Celsius is this average comfortable room temperature. The average temperature of the Earth at about 15 degrees, but it's usually referred to at 288 degrees Kelvin. So we have Kelvin, Celsius, and Fahrenheit, which are the main three temperature scales that people use. So 288, pentagram, and the average temperature of the Earth. Now here's an interesting one. So we have 273. So the average temperature at the Earth's equator is, again, with a slight fluctuation because talking averages, but 20.145 C, and the average surface temperature of the sun, or the sun at the equator, that's at a ratio of 1 to 273. So at the average temperature at the equator multiplied by 273, you get the temperature of the sun, surface temperature. Now what's nice is because now we have the Fahrenheit scale, the Kelvin scale, and the Celsius scale. So in Celsius, at sea temperature at 0 degrees, that's where water freezes, and water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. So that's 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That's where water freezes. So on the Kelvin scale, water freezes at 273.15 Kelvin. Absolute zero, when everything freezes, and that's just the low. At that temperature, everything stops. There's a relationship between pressure and volume, and at minus 273 on so absolute zero, minus 273.15 Celsius. Water freezes at 273.15 Kelvin. Now, that's a nice one because the cosmic microwave background, or the temperature in space, is 2.73 Kelvin. 273, sun, yeah, now there's also something called Charles's law, which has to do how gases expand in heat. So you probably, anything, even like during the summer months or hot, if something's in heat, it expands, and if it's cold, it contracts. That's the way. There's a relationship between pressure, volume, and temperature. And Charles's law on ideal gases, that's at a ratio of 1 to 273. 1 to 273, which has a lot to do. So the temperature of sound varies according to temperature. Speed of sound varies according to temperature, and that's the equation for it. And you'll see more in the following episodes how important 273 is in weights. We'll get to weights, but also in technology, especially computing, and I'll get to that in the next episodes. So 273 joining nicely through, and 288 and 72, as in this hidden behind there, the optimal room temperature, and 36 degrees pretty much describing the human body temperature. But there's more to this. So there's another temperature scale introduced by Isaac Newton, the alchemist, and we'll get to that because also the weights and measure the weights systems, how they coordinate with these same numbers in the temperature systems. Well, anyway, in the Newton scale, Newton the alchemist, water begins to boil, so 100 degrees Celsius. Water begins to boil at 33 degrees on the Newton scale. Water boils vehemently, so it really starts bubbling. So that's why when you get those little bubbles, water's started to boil. That's 33 degrees Newton, or 100 degrees C. And 34, which is a Fibonacci number, is where water boils vehemently. Now here's an interesting one. There's a harmony point between Celsius and Fahrenheit. So minus 40 degrees C is exactly minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, this very rare point. Now that's 233.15 Kelvin. 233 is a Fibonacci number. So back to these numbers, and I went through how they're Hashad or Niven numbers. So for instance, 3 plus 6 is 9, so 36, 3 plus 6 is 9, and it's divisible. How all of it, so 153 is a Niven or a Hashad number, Hashad. 33 and 273 are not, but all the rest are. And previous episodes I went into this lovely connection, how 153 and 2, how they all join, not just in the mystic tradition, but also in the measurable traditions. But in the early ones, I just rounded it off, so I had 3 plus 6 is 9. But really, when you do it, it should be 3 plus 6 plus 0 is 9. 360 divided by 9 is 40. Now that's an important number to consider, because that's the harmony point between Kelvin, between Celsius and Fahrenheit, and also in Kelvin, again, reference to Fibonacci 233, Fibonacci. Water begins to boil vehemently at 34 degrees on the Newton scale Fibonacci. But now we need to go back, because look, the mindset of the time. So people like Newton, the famous astronomer and Egyptologist, Piazzi Smythe, and John Greaves, and how they were interested in what was called the Pyramidal Inch, and how they had this idea about, well, the meaning of it. And so this school, which was around the Pyramidal Inch, was very invested in linking the Great Pyramid with Judeo-Christian history as found in the Bible. So there you see the vesica. That's a now if you were to keep drawing that circle, you'd see a vesica piscis, and that's at a 153 to 265, or the square root of 3 ratio. But this concept of trying to link biblical Judeo-Christian history to the pyramids was still around, but it was very, very big at that time. This is what these people were into. They even were publishing magazines such as this International Standard, magazine devoted to the discussion and dissemination of the wisdom created in the Great Pyramid of Giza. And it was mostly about Weights and Measures, so International Institute for Preserving and Perfecting Weights and Measures, and joining the Judeo-Christian and trying to connect it to these ancient places. So, and they were very important. They weren't just some like sort of little fringe group. They had very important connections. Former president was a subscriber, and Charles Piazzi Smythe, I mentioned him, so that's one of his diagrams of a pyramid, and he was using the measures and the number of courses to connect it to the generations born from Adam and Eve to Jesus, and this type of stuff. But he was also on the committee for standardizing time. He was Astronomer Royal for Scotland, and he was a believer in this Pyramidal Inch, but not just the measure system, but also very invested in bringing this into line with biblical tradition. So there's some screenshots from that International Standard magazine, and the magazine's full of it, of all this, connecting to Jesus especially, and the generations, and Judeo-Christian. That was what they were trying to do at the time. This was in their mindset. These were the guys into defining weights and measures. They were not just some, Newton, for instance, and he went to work for the Royal Bank. But the Holy Bible, and drawing these measure systems back to the Great Pyramid. So, for instance, the miraculous draft of fishes, John 21:10, 153 fishes. The Grand Gallery originally meant 153 feet. And, well, that's at a rate, it's actually, now without going, was it pyramidal inches or pyramidal feet, or let's just call it, or the accepted scale at that time, but either way, so 153.16 feet, or that would be also 153.14 or 16. Now that will sort of bring us back to this harmony between the Celsius, Kelvin, and Fahrenheit, because absolute zero in Fahrenheit is minus 453.67. That's very, very close to this length times 3. Now, Kelvin, Celsius, and you can see the dates, they were in the chunky part of this history where there was a strong connection between ancient legends, but Bible especially, and trying to bring these things together. Now, a reason I point that out is because of the 40 and 40 scale between Fahrenheit and Celsius. That brings us back to 33 degrees and Isaac Newton and the Newton scale. So water begins to boil at 33, 34 Fibonacci number. That's where it starts to boil violently, let's call it. Now, earlier episodes I went into the connections in the various ones. So, for instance, in 33, also 33 over 32, because 32 degrees Fahrenheit is where water boils on the Newton's, where water freezes on the Fahrenheit. 33 degrees on the Newton scale is where water begins to boil. But also like 153 again in this Masonic tradition, in all sorts of religions, and 273 again in both sort of a Bible and the esoteric traditions, sort of. But now why 40 degrees? Well, King David ruled for 40 years, 33 years in Jerusalem. 40 and 33. Jesus was 33 years when he died. But just before that, he spent 40 days in the wilderness. In Exodus, they wandered the desert for 40 years, and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights in Noah's account. So I can't be sure, but given that Newton and these other people who were so important in developing these systems were very invested or close to this mindset of esoteric and exoteric in the strict sense, sort of bringing them together, I would at least be curious about it. I wouldn't say directly this is the reason, but I think it's worth mentioning. So the pentagram with different systems of weights and measures and how it comes together. So measures of length, the compass, the clock and time, and now the thermometer, and soon we'll get into weights as well, because that comes into it as well. So temperature, scales, and these numbers which emerge from that. Some of these are laws built into nature. So some things can be arbitrarily made by the mind of humans, but some of these things are defined by nature itself, and somehow they manage to get these harmonized. And it's just a thing I think it's a thing of brilliance And even though I don't go too much for the religious ways, but anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Have a good